Well, tonight we're going to look at Acts chapter 23, and we're actually going to finish that chapter, looking at verses 12 through 35. And we're right in the middle of a section of Paul's witness before Jews, Gentiles, and Kings. And we're in the section where he's dealing basically with Jewish people. And God made a promise to Paul through Ananias to proclaim my name to the Gentiles and their kings and to the people of Israel. And in many ways, that's the outline for the rest of the book of Acts. From chapter 21 forward, Paul gives three main speeches in the rest of the book. In chapter 22, we've already looked at that one. That's Paul's speech before the Jewish people, the mob that was gathered outside the temple square. And Paul addressed the Jewish people, sharing his faith and his calling from God to proclaim the message of Jesus. In chapter 24, Paul will give a speech to a Gentile. It's a Gentile governor named Felix. And then in chapter 26, he'll give a speech to a king. That's King Agrippa. So those are yet to come. Right now, we are in the middle of Paul's witness before the Jews that started in chapter 21, verse 17. And we will conclude that tonight at the end of chapter 23. All of those events in those three chapters take place within 12 days. And we've already looked at three instances where Paul could have lost his life. Paul goes to the temple area. He's in the middle of a purification ceremony, supposedly to prove to the Jews that he's really Jewish, that he's following Jewish customs. Well, there was an individual from Ephesus who recognized him. He was a Jewish man who had come to celebrate the feast of Pentecost as well, and he accuses Paul of not keeping Jewish customs, of ignoring the law, even teaching Jews not to practice the ways of Moses, and for bringing a couple of Gentiles into the forbidden area of the temple. And by the time these charges spread around, a riot broke out. And according to Jewish law, you're not supposed to kill anybody inside the temple area. So they dragged Paul out of the temple area into the court of the Gentiles and proceed to try to beat him to death. So that's the first time Paul could have lost his life. Fortunately, right outside the temple area was a Roman garrison of 1,000 troops, and they had a high tower where they could look down over the temple area. And whoever was up there looking spotted the whole thing, yelled down to the commander, and 200 Roman troops show up and rescue Paul's life. Then Paul asked to give a speech to the people. And surprisingly, the people actually listened to Paul's speech. And they talk about his background. Paul even talks about Jesus, and nobody says a word. But as soon as Paul mentions the Gentiles, the fact that God had called him to go to the Gentiles, the people erupted once again. This was a time of Jewish nationalism. The Jewish people wanted freedom from the Romans. And there had been a lot of riots, a lot of insurrections, small scale, that had already broken out in Jerusalem. And the people were just itching to gain their freedom, and they hated Gentiles, especially the Romans, who happened to occupy the territory. So when they heard the word Gentiles, they went ballistic. And so the commander takes Paul back to the barracks, and he still has no idea what Paul is guilty of. So he decides he's going to examine Paul according to traditional Roman methods, which in the Roman Empire, there are two types of people: Roman citizens, and Roman citizens have rights. Non-Roman citizens, and they have no rights whatsoever, and most of them were treated as worse than animals. So the Roman commander's thinking, the Jewish people hate this man. I have no idea what he did wrong, but I'm in charge of this Jewish area. So basically, if I beat the man to death, nobody's going to complain. So basically, that's what he was going to do, to have Paul scourged. But Paul raises the question, is it lawful for you to scourge a Roman citizen without a trial? And when they hear that Paul is a Roman citizen, everybody just kind of drops and runs, because Roman citizens have rights. So this is the second time Paul could have died. If he had not been a Roman citizen, he would have died that day. Well, now the commander has an issue. Paul's a Roman citizen. He has to protect him. At the same time, he's going to try to make the Jewish people happy. So he sends Paul to the Sanhedrin, the Jewish high court, to try to figure out what in the world Paul has done that is making everybody so angry with him. Well, Paul gets into court and he begins giving a defense. And somehow he ends up being slapped, according to the high priest. The high priest had somebody slap him because Paul basically said, I'm innocent of all charges and I'm innocent before God. And the underlying tone was, if you agree with me, then you're right with God too. And if you disagree with me, you're not right with God. And the high priest caught the drift, had him slapped. And then Paul insults the high priest and basically gives a word of prophecy that God was going to strike the high priest, which 10 years later, the high priest gets assassinated by one of the Jewish freedom fighters. So the prophecy comes true. And then Paul ends up dividing the Sanhedrin, basically saying, I'm on trial because of my belief in the resurrection. And all the Pharisees said, yeah, we believe in the resurrection too. And the Sadducees all said, we don't believe in the resurrection. So at the end of the day, the Pharisees said, Paul's innocent. He's done nothing wrong. But the Sadducees want to get a hold of him and rip him to shreds. You know, this is the Supreme Court. You would think these guys would be dignified. But if you go back to Stephen's story early in the book of Acts, what happened to Stephen? He went before the Sanhedrin. They got so angry at him, they drug him out of court, took him to a place outside the temple area, and literally stoned him to death. They wanted to do the same thing to Paul. And the Roman commander had to call in more Roman troops in order to rescue Paul. And that is the third time that Paul could have lost his life. And all of this has happened in about 10 days. If you can imagine being in a situation where you are almost basically beat to death on 3 separate occasions. Then in chapter 23, verse 11, where we left off last week, Jesus appears to Paul and makes him a promise. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so shall you do in Rome. So Paul's thinking, I'm going to Rome. Which means one thing, I'm not going to die in Jerusalem. You know, because if I die in Jerusalem, I'm never going to make it to Rome. I'm going to Rome. And that gives him at least some assurance that he's going to live. And you would think at that point maybe his troubles are over, but not so fast. This first story we're going to look at tonight is the plot to ambush Paul. And I want to read that story and then we'll break it down verse by verse. So we're in Acts chapter 23, verses 12 through 22. So beginning in verse 12, it says, the next morning the Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves with an oath not to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. More than 40 men were involved in this plot. They went to the chief priests and elders and said, we have taken a solemn oath not to eat anything until we have killed Paul. Now then, you and the Sanhedrin petition the commander to bring him before you on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about his case. We are ready to kill him before he gets here. But when the son of Paul's sister heard of this plot, he went into the barracks and he told Paul. Then Paul called one of the centurions and said, take this young man to the commander. He has something to tell him. So he took him to the commander. The centurion said, Paul, the prisoner, sent for me and asked me to bring this young man to you because he has something to tell you. The commander took the young man by the hand, drew him aside and asked, what is it you want to tell me? He said, the Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul before the Sanhedrin tomorrow on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about him. Don't give in to them, because more than 40 of them are waiting in ambush for him. They have taken an oath not to eat or drink until they have killed him. They are ready now, waiting for your consent to their request." The commander dismissed the young man and cautioned him, "Don't tell anyone that you have reported this to me." So about the time you think Paul is safe, there is a fourth potential attempt on his life. And it happens the next morning. So the morning after this fiasco that takes place in the Sanhedrin, there are 40 men who form a conspiracy and make an oath before God that they're not going to eat or drink anything until they have killed Paul. This word oath is a strong word for an oath. It's almost an anathema, a curse. And it goes something like this: "May God do to us, and more also, if we eat or drink anything until we have killed Paul." So, they're not going to eat or drink until Paul is dead. And they've taken a solemn oath before God to make that happen. Well, Luke never tells us what happens to these 40 men. Obviously, they're not able to pull off their plot. But there was a clause in Jewish law that if you make an oath before God and unforeseen circumstances cause you not to be able to keep the oath, you can be released from the oath. So they didn't necessarily starve to death. These 40 men, in verse 13 tells us that there are 40 of them. They're involved in a plot, and they make an oath before God that they're going to kill Paul. Now, it's interesting that they bring God into this by making an oath, and they're about to violate one of God's commandments. You know, thou shalt not kill, do not murder. So somehow they got God in their scheme to murder Paul. It's also true that Paul is speaking the truth from God. And they're trying to get God on their side to approve of their murder of Paul. It's a reminder to all of us that just because someone says they're speaking from God doesn't mean they are. We've had many people today say, you know, they've had a vision from God, they've had a word from God, and they spout this out, and it doesn't come true. And obviously, if it doesn't come true, they didn't hear from God. Maybe ate some spicy food before they went to sleep, but they did not hear from God. So just because somebody says, God told me, doesn't necessarily mean that God told them. Because these 40 men would say, God told us not to eat or drink anything until Paul is dead. God didn't tell them that at all. Now, who are these 40 men? Chances are that, especially during this time, there were a lot of Jewish freedom fighters, a lot of zealots, a lot of people who tried to protect the Jewish faith, the Jewish nation, and if anybody tried to destroy that or harm that in any way, they were willing to use violence against them. And some of these Jewish freedom fighters, if they found out that you were, making deals with the Romans, or if you were somehow favoring the Romans, they would often sneak up to you in a crowd, and they had this short little sword that they carried, kind of like just a knife, and they would come up to you and pull it out and stab you in the crowd and let you die there as they walked off. This is some of the things that they were doing during this time. So this was a real threat, but they needed some help to pull it off. And verse 14 says they go to the chief priest and the elders to get some help. Well, who are the chief priests? These are members of the Sanhedrin. The chief priests obviously were Sadducees, and most of the elders were Sadducees as well. And so these 40 men know that the Sadducees already want Paul dead. So they're willing to join in on all of this. They're willing to join in on the plot to make this happen. And again, these are supposed to be spiritual men. They were supposed to be among the 70 most spiritual people in the land of Israel. But yet they're willing to have somebody murdered. Now, obviously, they didn't go to the Pharisees. They didn't go to the scribes or the teachers of the law, because the Pharisees actually sided with Paul. So they go to the Sadducees in order to get their help in pulling off the plot. And the plot is given in verse 15. So you and the Sanhedrin petition the commander to bring Paul before you on the pretext of wanting more information about him. And we are ready to kill him before he gets here. Now, on the surface, this seems like a really clever plot. Now, we know that the commander is still trying to figure out what in the world has Paul done. And we're going to find out that in order for him to send him on to the governor, he has to charge him with something. This emperor the commander Lysias cannot simply say, I'm sending Paul to you, governor, and I don't have a clue as to what he's guilty of, but somehow he's being charged, and I just want to get rid of him and send him off to you. He couldn't do that. He had to charge him with something. So we'll just get the commander to send Paul to the Sanhedrin one more time. And obviously he wants more information too, and we are willing to provide him with the information of what the charges are against Paul. So that part of it's true. But the commander knows what just happened the day before. Paul was before the Sanhedrin and a riot almost broke out. And he had to defend Paul in order to rescue his life. So will the commander go along with this? That's iffy. Here's the part these Jewish people didn't think through. The commander is not simply going to turn Paul loose and let him walk from the barracks to the courtroom by himself. Paul is a Roman citizen. He is to be guarded and protected until his trial takes place. So as Paul moves from the barracks to the courtroom, he will be escorted by Roman soldiers, armed Roman soldiers. And since the commander wants more information, he's coming too. So if Paul moves from the barracks to the courtroom, there could be 10, 15, 20 Roman soldiers and the commander surrounding Paul as he makes the trip. And do these 40 Jewish men really think that they're going to attack everybody in order to get to Paul? You know, to kill a Roman citizen was a serious matter. So if they were to kill Paul, that's a serious matter. To kill a Roman soldier, it's an even more serious matter. And God forbid they should kill the commander, because the Romans will retaliate and it will be ugly and many, many people will lose their life. So on the surface, this sounds like a really clever plan that just might work. But they didn't think through the details. And this could have turned into an ugly, bloody mess. But fortunately, it never happens. Verse 16 talks about Paul's family. It's interesting that Paul writes 13 or 14 letters in the New Testament, never mentions his family in any of those letters. In fact, this is the only place in the Bible that we learn anything about Paul's family. Now, Paul did tell us a couple chapters ago that he was born in Tarsus, but he was educated and grew up in Jerusalem. In fact, he was educated under Gamaliel, right there in the city of Jerusalem. Now, if Paul's whole family moved to Jerusalem, it's really no surprise that we find out that his sister still lives in Jerusalem. And his sister has a son, which would be Paul's nephew. So Paul's nephew somehow finds out about the plot. So you've got 40 men who are going to pull this off. And apparently they've been whispering and telling this to all kinds of people. You know, if you're going to pull something off, you've got to keep it quiet. But apparently these 40 guys were not keeping this quiet. And many think that Paul's nephew may have been working in the temple area and overheard some people talking. And now he knows about the plot. So not only did these guys not think through what might happen if they encountered Roman soldiers, they weren't even smart enough to keep it to themselves. Apparently they told too many people, and now Paul's nephew knows. And then Paul's nephew goes into the barracks and informs Paul. Well, Paul, again, is a Roman citizen. He's under basically protective custody at this point. He has rights. Family can visit him. In fact, it was quite common back then for family to bring food, blankets, and other personal items to the prisoners because the Romans really didn't do a good job of taking care of prisoners. It would be best if you had friends who could take care of you while you were in custody. So, Paul's nephew shows up, says, I want to talk to my Uncle Paul. And as long as the nephew isn't armed when he shows up, he can be escorted into the barracks and he can have a conversation with Paul. Then Paul calls one of the centurions after hearing about this plot and says, you need to take this young man to the commander because he has some important things to tell the commander. Now, Luke only gives us a glimpse of this story. Chances are the centurion, who's basically a Roman military officer in charge of 100 soldiers, would have said to Paul, okay, before I go to the commander, my boss, tell me what you got. You know, tell me why I should bother him. And Paul, of course, would have told about this plot. Now, the Romans loved peace. And the last thing they wanted was a riot, an ambush, or a murder, especially if Roman soldiers might get injured or die in the process. So this was some very important news. And this young man, Paul's nephew, was probably a teenager, maybe in his early 20s, just a kid. But he's going to go see the commander because of the story that he has to tell. So he takes him to the commander, and the centurion explains to the commander, this is Paul's nephew, and he has something very important to tell you. So the commander takes the young man by the hand, draws him aside, and asks, what is it that you want to tell me? Now, it's interesting that the commander's being very nice here. The commander, before had a reputation of being, really a tough guy. But apparently, at least on this occasion, he was a nice guy to Paul's nephew. And basically, Paul's nephew retells the story that we just talked about in verses 12 through 15. The new part that he adds is the appeal is going to come tomorrow. Tomorrow, the Jewish people are going to come to you, and they're going to want to have another hearing. And they want you to bring Paul to the Sanhedrin. Apparently, these guys didn't want to fast for very long. Remember, they're not going to eat or drink anything till Paul's dead. So let's get on with the show. We're hungry, So we'll do this tomorrow and get this thing over with. So, and again, it's under the pretext of wanting more information. Don't give in to them because there's an ambush. And they've taken an oath. They're ready, just waiting for you to say yes so they can try to pull this off. And then the commander dismisses the young man with this caution. Don't tell anyone what you've just reported to me. In other words, you overheard some people talking about their plot. Don't you go out and commit the same mistake in telling a bunch of people about what you did. Because if these 40 guys find out that you uncovered their plot and then went to the commander, they may not be able to kill Paul, but they can kill you. So keep your mouth shut and don't tell anybody. And so, for the fourth time, Paul's life is going to be spared because the commander is going to send him to Caesarea. So let me read those verses, Acts chapter 23, verses 23 through 35, and then we'll talk about them. So beginning with verse 23, then he called 2 of his centurions and ordered them, get ready a detachment of 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea at 9 tonight. Provide mounts for Paul, so that he may be taken safely to Governor Felix. He wrote a letter as follows: Claudius Lysias, to his excellency, Governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews, and they were about to kill him. But I came with my troops and rescued him, for I had learned that he is a Roman citizen. I wanted to know why they were accusing him, so I brought him to their Sanhedrin. I found that the accusation had to do with questions about their law, but there was no charge against him that deserved death or imprisonment. When I was informed of a plot to be carried out against the man, I sent him to you at once. I also ordered his accusers to present to you their case against him. So the soldiers, carrying out their orders, took Paul with them during the night and brought him as far as Antipatris. The next day, they let the cavalry go on with them while they returned to the barracks. When the cavalry arrived in Caesarea, they delivered the letter to the governor and handed Paul over to him. The governor read the letter and asked what province he was from. Learning that he was from Cilicia, he said, I will hear your case when your accusers get here. Then he ordered that Paul be kept under guard in Herod's palace. So the commander decides that the best thing to do with Paul is to get him out of town. And he can now send him to Caesarea. That's where the governor's headquarters were located, and that's where the governor basically lived. Now, chances are the commander would have eventually done this anyways. The Jews have a capital charge against Paul. They want him dead, and a capital charge has to go to the governor, so he's got to eventually send him anyways. And I think all along, Lysias was thinking, just tell me what the man did so I can include it in my letter and ship him off to the governor so I can be done with this case. And he's finally come to that point. And now that they're trying to ambush him, it's not safe for Paul to stay in Jerusalem. And his job, Lysias, was to keep order in Jerusalem. And if he can get Paul out of town, chances are the Jewish people will quiet down or take their anger to Caesarea and let the governor deal with it. So that's his plan. So he calls 2 centurions, and again, these were men in charge of 100 troops, and he ordered them to get ready a detachment of 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea at 9 o'clock tonight. So this is going to happen immediately. Now, he's already been told by Paul's nephew that tomorrow the Jewish people are going to come to you and request a hearing. So he's thinking, I'm going to get him out of here tonight. So that way, when they show up tomorrow, I can say, he's not here anymore. So he can end that entire plot. So there's this sense of urgency. And he also wants to do this covertly, so he does it at night, so that nobody finds out that Paul is being led on to another place. Now, it's interesting how many soldiers he sends. 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen. Now, the soldiers and the spearmen could be the same people, in which case 270 troops are going to guard Paul. If the spearmen are not the same as the soldiers, We're talking 470 troops to guard one man. Talk about overkill. In that garrison, there were 1,000 troops, and he may have just sent half of them to get Paul to Caesarea. Now he knows there's only 40 who are trying to ambush Paul, but he's got them outmanned and outnumbered, and he's got more weapons than, this isn't even going to be close if these guys try to do anything. So again, he just wants Paul safely out of his jurisdiction, on to the governor in Caesarea. So he also provided mounts for Paul. That was either a horse or some kind of animal so that he could ride to get him safely to Caesarea. Now, from Jerusalem to Caesarea is about 65 miles. And so if everybody can ride on horseback, and eventually they do, it can go much faster. He's going to send him to Governor Felix. And his official name, as soon as I find it here, is Tiberius Claudius Felix. He became governor in AD 52. That's when he was appointed. And this is about AD 57, 58. So he hasn't been the governor for very long. One of the big issues that he is facing as a governor is all the Jewish freedom fighters trying to overthrow the government and to stir up the people to rally to form an army to basically defeat the Romans and drive them out of town. But Felix gets very angry when that happens, and he responds with a lot of violence. So things get very ugly. And the Jewish people hate him. They can't stand him. They want nothing to do with him. They think he's a horrible person. In fact, Tacitus, the Roman historian, describes him by the fact that he exercised royal power with the mind of a slave. At one point, Felix was a slave. Then he became a freed slave. But he still had a slave mentality. And he kind of ruled with that kind of understanding. A very brutal man. So that's where Paul's going next. So he writes a letter as follows. And it was required under Roman law, if you're going to move a prisoner from one jurisdiction to the other, you have to write a letter explaining what he did, why he was arrested, and what are the charges against him. So that the one who receives the letter already knows what's going on and is able to deal with it. So he writes a letter, which, by the way, this is the only letter in the Bible written by a secular person to another secular person. Interesting. Now, when the Greeks wrote letters, it's different than how we write letters. When we write a letter today, we say, to so-and-so. And at the very end, we sign our name. But this was a scroll. So if you signed your name at the end, you'd have to undo the entire scroll to find out who it was from. So they did it backwards. So it was normal to say this writer to recipient greetings. And that's what we have here. Claudius Lysias, the writer, to His Excellency Governor Felix, the recipient, greetings. So this is the first time that we learn the name of the commander. I've been calling him by his name all along because I read ahead. But if you were reading this for the first time, this is the first time you finally know the name of the commander. He's been talked about since chapter 21, but now you know his name. His name is Claudius Lysias. And we learned last week that Claudius Lysias became a Roman citizen because he bought it. Chances are he bribed his way into Roman citizenship, and the emperor at the time was Emperor Claudius. So it was common back then, when you become a Roman citizen, to take on a Roman name. So he does. He takes the emperor's name as a way of saying thank you to the emperor. So Claudius is his Roman name. Lysias is his Greek name. By the way, Paul was born a Roman citizen. And by being born a Roman citizen, you had to take on a Roman name. His Roman name is Paul. His Jewish name is Saul. And just like in English, there's only one letter difference. In Greek, there's only one letter difference as well. So, he's writing this letter to the governor Felix. And he calls him His Excellency, whether he believes that or not, just to be nice to the governor. And it's always appropriate to say greetings. We would say hello or something like that. Well, in verse 27, we get to the heart of the matter. It is Lysias' responsibility to explain who Paul is, what he's done, and what are the charges against him. So, when you get to tell the story in your words, you can slant it any way you want. And Lysias is going to slant the story so that he comes out looking very good. Imagine that. Well, this man, Paul, was seized by the Jews, and that's true. And they were about to kill him. That's true. They drug him out of the temple area, and they were trying to beat him to death. But I came with my troops and rescued him. That's also true. But Lysias doesn't include some facts. One fact is, when he got to Paul, he arrested him with 2 chains. He put chains on him, which it was illegal to put chains on a Roman citizen. I'll just leave that part out. Then he says, I did this because I learned that he's a Roman citizen. So I just rescued a Roman citizen. I did a good thing. Well, how did he find out he was a Roman citizen? Well, Lysias was about to torture Paul to death, and that's when Paul revealed that he was a Roman citizen. Does he include the fact that he almost tortured a Roman citizen? No, leave that part out. Just make yourself look good, which he does. Then he talks about the Sanhedrin, and here he's pretty much, he's right on with what he says here. I want to find out what they're accusing him of, so I take him to their Sanhedrin, their court. And I found that the accusation had to do with questions about their law, Jewish law. So this is a dispute among Jewish people about Jewish law. And then the most important statement that he makes: there was no charge against him that deserved death or imprisonment. In other words, Paul has not broken any Roman law. And as Luke is writing Acts, that's what he wants the reader to understand. That Christianity is not a threat to the Roman Empire. Christianity is a part of the Jewish religion. Now, the Romans had given the Jews freedom of religion. That was part of the deal that they made. And if Christianity is part of Judaism, Christianity should be a legal religion in the Roman Empire. And that's the point that Luke wants to make. Remember, it's about their law, their religion. And the man has broken no Roman law. So, Christianity should be given freedom of religion. From this moment on, Luke makes a big emphasis of the fact that Paul is innocent. In fact, no Roman authority will ever accuse Paul of anything. He's always innocent. What did Pilate say about Jesus? Pretty much the same thing. I find nothing that he has done that deserves death or imprisonment. That was Pilate's conclusion as well. And of course, Pilate was a Roman. So the main point, as Lysias tries to figure out what in the world is going on with Paul and why do the Jews not hate him so much, it's about their law. But when it comes to our law, the man is innocent. Verse 30, there's a plot against him, and that's the occasion for sending him on. There's a plot against his life, so I'm sending him to you at once because I'm doing my job. I also ordered his accusers to present to you their case against him. Now, as Lysias is writing this letter, he hasn't told the Jewish people anything. He's going to wait till the next day when Paul's completely out of town. Then he's going to tell them. In fact, they probably came to him the next day and said, Commander, we'd like to have, another hearing with Paul in the Sanhedrin. And Lysias, probably with this great grin on his face, said, Paul's not here anymore. I sent him to Caesarea. So you have to take your case against him to Caesarea. And the governor gets to hear the case. So the soldiers, in verse 31, is back to the story. They carry out their orders. They take Paul with them during the night, and they bring him as far as Antipatris, which was about 37 miles from Jerusalem. So at that point, Paul is safe. In fact, there's some question in verse 32 about how long did the foot soldiers actually go with Paul until they left and came back and simply left him with the horsemen. Because obviously, if you've got foot soldiers, you can only go as fast as they can walk or march or run. But if you're on horseback, you can go a whole lot faster. And once he was basically out of Jerusalem and out of some of the Jewish territory, Paul was safe. In fact, from the city that we just mentioned all the way to Caesarea, that's Gentile territory, so there's no issue. And plus, he's still got 70 soldiers on horseback. I mean, he's still very well protected. Well, finally they arrive in Caesarea. They deliver the letter to the governor, and then they hand Paul over to him, again to be kept in protective custody. The governor reads the letter, and then he asks what province Paul is from. And he learns that he's from the province of Cilicia, which is where Tarsus is located. It was common back then to have the trial in the province where the crime was allegedly committed. Sometimes the case could be sent back to the province where the defendant was actually from. So, if the governor wants to, he can send the case to the province of Cilicia, back to Tarsus. But if he does that, he's going to make the Jewish people really angry, because they would have to travel all that distance in order to present the case against Paul. And plus, at this point, Cilicia isn't a full province. It's really just part of Syria at this time, which means that Governor Felix does have jurisdiction over the matter. So he says, I will hear the case when your accusers get here. And according to Roman law, they have 2 years to get there. They don't take that long, but that's how long you have. If you present a case, it can get tied up in court for as many as 2 years. If after 2 years the accusers don't show up, the prisoner walks. He's free. Very quickly. So then it says that he ordered that Paul be kept under guard in Herod's palace, the Praetorium. This was a fortress, basically, that Herod the Great had built. It's now kind of a Roman headquarters, and that's where Paul's going to be kept until his accusers show up. Which, by the way, they show up in chapter 24, the very next chapter. So they don't wait much time. So we wrap things up tonight. And as we go back to that first story, when the ambush against Paul was not successful, we see God's hand in that whole thing. Because God had made a promise to Paul, you're going to Rome, which means you're not going to die in Jerusalem. And even though God's name is not mentioned in that story, we see God working behind the scenes in the circumstances. What's the odds of Paul's nephew hearing about the plot? Probably not great. But do you think God made sure that Paul's nephew heard about the plot? Absolutely. God was working behind the scenes. And often in our lives we think, what's going on with my circumstances? And often we can't figure out our circumstances. But we can rest assured God's in control. God knows about our circumstances. And God is working even behind the scenes in our circumstances. God has a plan. God has a purpose. God always keeps His promises. And God kept His promise so far in this book to the Apostle Paul. And He'll keep His promises to us as well. He's working in our lives. And I'm sure Paul's thinking, wow, I just spent 12 days in Jerusalem. They only tried to kill me 4 times. But God got me through. And now I'm in Caesarea, in a new place. And wonder what God's going to do next. Well, as we look at our lives, God gets us through some stuff. And then we wonder what's next on the horizon. Well, we need to trust Him with whatever is next on the horizon. Well, let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank You for these stories about Paul. And Father, thank You that You are God throughout these stories. That You're in control, even though it looks like other people are in control. And You have a plan, You have a purpose, and You are making sure things end up the way You want them. And Father, many times when we look at our lives, we can't make sense of what's going on. There are things going on in our lives that we wish were not going on in our lives. But Father, You know about them. You have a plan, You have a purpose, and we need to trust You. And Father, I pray that we would learn to trust You even when life doesn't make sense. Even when things are not going the way we want them to go. Father, we need to trust You. So help us to do that. Grow our faith in You as we trust You with everything that touches our lives. I pray in Jesus' name, amen.